Nobody expects salvation from a girl who can't hear the danger coming. You don't think about the silence until it's broken by the rumble of 500 Harleys headed straight for a death trap. She was 19, barefoot, and completely deaf. They were the Hells Angels, out on an annual memorial run, totally unaware that a blind curve hid a 50-foot drop into nothing. This is the story of 3 miles of bloody footprints, an unspoken warning, and a debt that 500 outlaws swore they would never forget. Sadie didn't hear the bridge collapse. She felt it. It started as a deep, resonant shudder in the floorboards of her grandfather's cabin. The kind of vibration that rattled the cheap porcelain plates in the cupboards and traveled straight up through the soles of her feet. Sadie had been deaf since birth. She didn't know the sharp, cracking report of snapping steel, or the deafening roar of thousands of gallons of flash flood water tearing through a narrow gorge. She only knew physics. She knew pressure. She knew that the earth beneath her boots was moving in a way it never had before. She dropped the damp dish towel on the counter and walked out onto the front porch. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic smell of ozone and the rich, rotting scent of overturned soil. It had been raining for 3 days straight. Not a gentle drizzle, but a violent, relentless deluge that turned the steep slopes of the canyon into slick mudslides. Route 119 was a winding, treacherous snake of a highway that cut directly through the canyon. It was isolated, mostly forgotten by the State Highway Department, and used primarily by logging trucks, lost tourists, and locals who knew exactly how hard to take the hairpin turns. And about a quarter-mile from Sadie's cabin, the highway crossed over the gorge via the old Turner Creek Bridge. Sadie stepped off the porch. The mud immediately sucked at her rubber boots. She walked down the driveway, her eyes narrowed against the driving rain, pulling her waterproof jacket tighter around her ribs. When she reached the shoulder of the highway, she stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. The bridge was gone. It wasn't just damaged. It had been entirely erased. The surging brown water of Turner Creek, swollen to 10 times its normal size, had ripped the concrete pillars straight out of the bedrock. The asphalt had snapped like a brittle cracker. Where there had once been a 2-lane road spanning a 50-foot drop, there was now only a gaping, violent void. The water below churned with uprooted pine trees, twisted metal guardrails, and boulders the size of pickup trucks. Worse, the washout was perfectly hidden. It sat just beyond a blind, sweeping left-hand curve, flanked by towering rock walls. If you were driving north, you wouldn't see the drop-off until you were 20 feet away. At 60 miles an hour, 20 feet was a death sentence. Sadie stared at the void. A cold knot formed in her stomach, tighter and heavier than the dread of the storm. She turned around and looked back down the highway. South, it was the first Saturday of June. For as long as Sadie could remember, the first Saturday of June meant one thing in the canyon: the run. Every year, a massive column of bikers came roaring up Route 119. They were Hell's Angels. 500 of them, sometimes more. Her grandfather had told her once that it was a memorial ride for a charter president who had died on this very highway decades ago. Sadie didn't care about their politics, their patches, or the criminal element attached to their name. To a deaf girl living in absolute isolation, they were just a phenomenon. She looked forward to it every year. She would sit on the hood of her grandfather's truck and feel the massive, thrumming vibration of 500 V-twin engines shaking the atmosphere. It was a physical wall of power. It felt alive. They always came through right around noon. Sadie looked down at her watch. The glass was cracked, but the hands were clear. 11:15 a.m. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of her mouth. They were coming. 500 men, riding in tight 2x2 formation, doing at least 70 miles an hour, heading straight for a blind curve that ended in a 50-foot drop into a rock-filled gorge. The front of the pack would go over the edge before they even had time to touch their brakes. The bikes behind them wouldn't be able to stop in time. It would be a slaughter, a massive, tangled pile-up of screaming metal, boiling oil, and crushed bone. Sadie turned and sprinted back up the mud-slicked driveway to the cabin. She threw open the door, tracking thick brown dirt across the linoleum. She grabbed the heavy black receiver of the landline off the wall. She pressed it to her ear, resting her fingertips against the plastic earpiece to feel for the slight, static buzz of a dial tone. Nothing. Dead air. The storm had taken the lines down somewhere up the mountain. She threw the phone aside and grabbed the keys to her grandfather's rusted 1998 Ford F-150. She ran back outside, yanked the heavy driver's side door open, and threw herself into the cracked leather seat. She jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. She felt the sluggish, heavy grind of the starter motor through the steering column. It faded into a pathetic click. She pumped the gas pedal, turned the key again. Click, click, click. The battery was cold, old, and completely dead. She slammed her palms against the steering wheel in frustration. She had no phone. She had no truck. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, in the wrong direction. Sadie looked out the windshield. Through the sweeping arcs of the windshield wipers she had manually pushed out of the way. She looked down Route 119. The straightaway where the bikers usually hit their top speed was 3 miles south. If she could reach the straightaway, she could wave them down. If she tried to stop them too close to the blind curve, they wouldn't have the braking distance. She had to intercept them on the flat. 3 miles. 45 minutes. She was a 19-year-old girl who occasionally hiked. She wasn't a runner. But sitting in the dead quiet of the truck cab, looking at the rain wash over the cracked glass, she pictured the alternative. She pictured the vibration of 500 engines suddenly ending in the violent, crunching physics of metal impacting stone. Outlaws or not, nobody deserved to die like that. Sadie kicked her heavy, mud-caked rubber boots off. They were too clunky. She couldn't run 3 miles in them. They would just slow her down and suck into the mud on the shoulder. She grabbed a pair of worn canvas sneakers from the passenger floorboard, shoved them onto her bare feet, and didn't bother tying the laces properly. She stepped out of the truck. The rain hit her face like cold needles. She started to run. The first mile was adrenaline. The second mile was agony. Route 119 was not meant for pedestrians. There were no sidewalks. The shoulder was nothing but broken asphalt crumbling into a ditch filled with jagged gravel, broken glass, and wet pine needles. Sadie ran on the left side, facing the imaginary traffic, staying tight to the white line. Her breath tore in and out of her lungs, silent to her ears, but burning like fire in her chest. The rain had slowed to a miserable, steady drizzle, but the humidity in the canyon made the air feel thick and unbreathable. Every time her foot struck the pavement, a shockwave of pain traveled up her shins. The canvas sneakers were soaked through within the first 10 minutes. The cheap fabric rubbed brutally against her wet heels. Around the 1.5-mile mark, the left shoe simply gave out. The rotten laces snapped, and the shoe flew off her foot, tumbling into the muddy ditch. Sadie didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She just kicked the right shoe off to match, leaving it on the yellow line, and kept running. Barefoot. The road was a meat grinder. Decades of heavy logging trucks had chewed the surface of the highway into a coarse, pitted cheese grater. Small, sharp stones embedded in the asphalt, dug into the tender arches of her feet. Within a few hundred yards, her soles were raw. Then they were bleeding. She could feel the warm, slick slide of her own blood mixing with the cold rainwater on the pavement. Why am I doing this? The cynical thought crept into her mind as a piece of green glass sliced into the ball of her right foot. She stumbled, falling hard onto her knees, tearing the skin over her kneecaps. She knelt there for a second, the rough grit of the road grinding into her open wounds. They are criminals. They run drugs. They hurt people. It was true. The men she was trying to save were not Boy Scouts. They were 1%ers, rough men who lived by a violent code. If they saw her walking on a sunny day, they might not even give her a second glance, or worse, they might harass her. But Sadie pushed herself back up. Her grandfather, a retired mechanic with a chest full of shrapnel from Vietnam and a profound distrust of the government, had worked on bikes for guys like this. "A man's sins are his own, Sadie." He had signed to her once, his grease-stained hands moving in sharp, precise gestures. But gravity doesn't care about patches. And dead is dead. Dead is dead. She forced her bleeding feet back into a harsh, uneven jog. The pain was blinding. Her vision swam, the dark green pines blurring into the grey sky. Her muscles screamed, heavy with lactic acid. She didn't know how fast she was moving. Time was an abstract concept. She only had the rhythm of her own heartbeat, pounding in her temples, and the burning need to reach the straightaway. 2 miles. She felt the vibration of a vehicle. A heavy logging truck blew past her in the opposite direction, kicking up a massive spray of dirty water that knocked her sideways into the ditch. She clawed her way back onto the asphalt, her hand scraped and bleeding. She was covered in grey sludge from the knees down. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She looked like a feral animal, a ghost haunting the canyon highway. 2.5 miles. The road began to level out. The towering rock walls on either side began to recede, opening up into the wide, flat valley floor that preceded the twisting canyon ascent. The straightaway. She had made it. Sadie stumbled into the dead center of the highway, right on the double yellow line. She stopped. Her legs were shaking so violently she thought her bones might snap. She looked down. Her feet were destroyed, covered in deep lacerations, bruised purple, and streaked with bright red blood that was immediately washed away by the rain. She stood there, breathing heavily, clutching her sides. Now she waited. And then she felt it. It didn't begin as a sound. For Sadie, it began as a profound shift in the atmosphere. First, the puddles resting in the shallow divots of the asphalt began to ripple. Tiny concentric circles formed on the surface of the water, shivering in a chaotic dance. Then, the vibration transferred to the road itself. A deep, heavy thrum that bypassed her non-functioning ears and registered directly in her chest cavity. It felt like standing next to a massive industrial generator. She looked down the long grey ribbon of the straightaway. A single headlight pierced the gloom. Then 2, then 20, then 50. They came out of the grey mist like a mechanized cavalry. A massive, undulating serpent of black leather, gleaming chrome, and blinding lights. They were riding in a tight, disciplined, staggered formation, eating up the asphalt at 75 miles an hour. At the absolute front of the pack rode Boone. Boone was 38, built like a brick wall, and wore the heavy burden of leadership on his leather-clad shoulders. He was the road captain for this charter. It was his job to ensure the pack moved safely, stayed together, and arrived on time. He didn't like surprises. He hated variables. And right now, screaming down Route 119 in the pouring rain, he was hyper-focused on the treacherous canyon ascent ahead. Through his rain-streaked visor, Boone saw a shape in the road, about a quarter-mile ahead. Dead center. He didn't roll off the throttle immediately. Out here, shapes in the road were usually deer or debris washed down from the cliffs. But as the distance closed, the shape resolved into a figure. A girl. She was standing directly on the double yellow line, waving her arms in wide, frantic arcs. She was soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and looked completely deranged. Boone swore inside his helmet. He didn't want to stop. Stopping 500 bikes on a wet road was dangerous. It ruined the momentum. It broke the flow. A cynical part of his brain told him it was an ambush, a trap set by a rival crew, or maybe just a meth head wandering out of the woods looking to get run over. He hit his turn signal, intending to just swerve around her, but as he closed to within 200 yards, he saw her face. She wasn't high. She wasn't panicked in a scattered way. Her eyes were locked directly onto his bike, and her face was set in a mask of absolute, terrifying desperation. She was screaming something, though the roar of his engine drowned it out entirely. She was pointing violently behind her, up toward the canyon, and she wasn't moving. She was holding her ground directly in his path. Crazy bitch, Boone thought. At 100 yards, instinct took over. Boone squeezed the clutch and clamped down on the brakes. Hard. Behind him, the chain reaction began. Brake lights flared in a massive wave of red. Tires squealed and hissed against the wet asphalt. The deafening roar of the engines shifted into a cacophony of downshifts, heavy braking, and the harsh clatter of boots hitting the pavement as riders fought to keep their heavy machines upright. Boone's Harley skidded, the rear tire breaking loose for a terrifying fraction of a second before he wrangled it back in line. He came to a shuddering halt exactly 10 feet away from the girl. The sheer force of the pack stopping displaced the air, hitting Sadie like a physical gust of wind. The vibration was incredible. 500 massive engines idling in the canyon, a low, thudding heartbeat that shook her teeth. Boone kicked his kickstand down and swung his heavy leg over the bike. He ripped his helmet off. He was furious. "What the hell is your problem?" he roared, his voice thick with gravel and rage. "Are you trying to get yourself killed? I should have run you over." Sadie saw his face contort. She saw his mouth moving aggressively. The posture of his body, the veins standing out on his neck. It was pure intimidation. Men like this commanded fear. She didn't step back. She raised her hands and pointed to her ears, shaking her head. Deaf. Boone stopped mid-step. He looked at her hands, then at her face. The anger in his eyes shifted to severe annoyance. He took a step closer, exaggerating the movement of his lips. "Move out of the road!" He pointed aggressively towards the ditch. Sadie shook her head, frantically. She pointed behind her, toward the winding canyon road that disappeared into the trees. She made a sweeping motion with her hand, then suddenly dropped her hand straight down. A cliff. A fall. Boone crossed his arms over his cut, the death's head patch stretching across his chest. He wasn't buying it. A few other bikers, heavily tattooed and scowling, walked up behind him. "What's the hold-up, Boone?" One of them, a massive guy with a braided beard named Reno, grunted. "Crazy deaf kid playing traffic cop." Boone muttered, not taking his eyes off Sadie. "Grab her and pull her off the road. We got a schedule." Reno stepped forward, reaching a massive, leather-gloved hand out toward Sadie's arm. Sadie didn't run. Instead, she dropped to her knees, right there on the wet asphalt. Boone paused. Reno stopped. Sadie scraped her bleeding fingers through the thick layer of wet dirt and debris sitting in a depression on the road. With frantic, jagged strokes, she drew 2 parallel lines. The road. She drew a curve. Then, right at the apex of the curve, she violently wiped away a huge section of the lines, leaving an empty gap. She looked up at Boone, then stabbed her finger into the empty space. She looked him dead in the eyes, her chest heaving, rain dripping from her chin. She pointed to him, pointed to the bikes, and then pointed to the gap in the dirt. "You will fall." The silence among the men at the front of the pack was profound, despite the thrumming engines. They weren't stupid men. You didn't survive decades on the road by ignoring warnings. Boone looked down at the crude drawing in the dirt. He looked at the girl. For the first time, he looked closely. He saw her ragged breathing. He saw the soaked clothes. And then he looked down at her feet. They were destroyed, smeared with blood, dirt, and raw flesh. The asphalt around her knees was stained pink from the rainwater washing over her open wounds. She hadn't wandered out of the woods. She had run, far and fast, over brutal terrain. Boone's jaw tightened. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp calculation. He turned to Reno. "Take your bike," Boone commanded, his voice suddenly quiet, stripped of all anger. "Ride up to the Turner Creek Bridge. Don't go fast. Keep your eyes peeled on the curve." Reno didn't argue. He nodded, turned, and jogged back to his bike. The pack parted for him as he throttled up, pulling past Boone and Sadie, accelerating up the wet canyon road. Boone stood in the rain, looking down at Sadie. She was still kneeling by her drawing, shivering uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was fading. He didn't speak. He just waited. 5 minutes later, the low rumble of a single engine echoed back down the canyon walls. Reno was coming back. He didn't ride back with the swagger he had left with. He pulled his bike to a stop next to Boone and killed the engine. The silence that fell over the front of the pack was heavy. Reno pulled his helmet off. His face, usually ruddy and weather-beaten, was completely pale. He looked at Boone, then slowly looked down at the shivering, bleeding deaf girl on the asphalt. "Boone," Reno said, his voice trembling slightly. "The bridge is gone. The whole damn mountain washed out. A 50-foot drop, right past the blind apex." Reno swallowed hard, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. If we hit that curve at speed... Reno trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Boone stood perfectly still. The cold rain soaked through his leather, but he didn't feel it. He slowly turned his head to look at Sadie. She was watching his face, reading the shift in his expression. She knew they understood. The tension in her shoulders broke. She collapsed forward, her hands hitting the pavement, completely spent. Boone didn't order anyone to move. He didn't yell. He stepped forward, dropping to one knee on the wet asphalt, staining his heavy denim jeans with the same blood and mud that coated the girl. He reached out and gently grasped Sadie by the shoulder. She flinched, looking up at him. Boone didn't sign. He didn't know how, but he looked at her with a profound, terrifying intensity. The look of a man who had just looked death in the mouth and realized an angel had slammed the jaws shut. "Doc!" Boone roared over his shoulder, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Get up here! Now!" A man pushed through the tight ring of leather-clad bodies. He didn't have the sheer, hulking mass of Boone or Reno. He was lean, stringy, with a graying beard and faded ink bleeding into the deep wrinkles of his forearms. He carried a heavy olive-drab canvas bag. The patch on his chest simply read, "Doc." He didn't ask questions. He dropped to his knees in the muddy puddle next to Boone and opened the bag. For Sadie, the world was a chaotic, terrifying, silent film. She couldn't hear the harsh, barked orders Boone was suddenly throwing at the men around him. She couldn't hear the heavy thud of boots running back toward the line of idling motorcycles. She only felt the intense, overwhelming vibration of 500 V-twin engines shaking the asphalt beneath her bleeding knees, and the sudden jarring warmth of a heavy, dry flannel shirt being draped over her shivering shoulders. Doc took her right foot in his hands. He didn't flinch at the blood. He'd seen worse in places much further away than this canyon. He pulled a clear plastic bottle of saline from his bag and squeezed it hard, jetting the freezing water directly into the deep lacerations on her soles, to clear the coarse asphalt grit. Sadie's entire body went rigid, her jaw locked. She threw her head back, her eyes squeezing shut against a scream that never made it past her throat. "Hold her steady," Doc muttered, reaching for a square of iodine-soaked gauze. Boone's massive hands clamped down on her shoulders. They were heavy, immovable, but surprisingly careful. He didn't crush her collarbones. He just anchored her to the earth. Doc scrubbed the iodine into the raw meat of her heel. Sadie jerked violently, her fingernails biting into the wet pavement until the tips turned white. She opened her eyes, gasping for breath, looking wildly between the faces of the men surrounding her. They weren't scowling anymore. The aggression was entirely gone. Instead, there was a grim, shared discomfort. These were men who dealt out violence, who understood pain. Watching a 19-year-old girl silently endure the sting of raw iodine on flayed skin was hitting a nerve they didn't often expose. "She's tough," Reno grunted, standing a few feet back, his arms crossed. Most grown men would be howling. "She ran 3 miles on a cheese grater," Doc replied, working quickly to wrap a thick layer of white gauze around her instep, pulling it tight to stop the bleeding. "Tough doesn't cover it. She's in shock." He finished the right foot and moved to the left. Sadie watched his hands. He worked with the practiced, mechanical rhythm of someone who knew exactly how to patch a broken human body. When he finished taping the second bandage, he looked up at her face. He reached out and gently tapped 2 fingers against his own temple, then gave her a thumbs up. "You're okay." Sadie stared at him, exhausted, and offered a weak, trembling nod. Boone stood up, the water dripping from the brim of his leather cut. He looked down the endless line of headlights stretching back into the grey mist. The situation was a logistical nightmare. They had 500 bikes on a 2-lane road, flanked by a rock wall on one side and a sheer drop into a ditch on the other. They couldn't go forward. Turning around was going to take an hour of brutal, meticulous maneuvering. A rusted black Ford 350 van rumbled up the shoulder, its heavy tires crushing wet pine branches. It was the club's chase vehicle, driven by a young, heavily tattooed prospect. He slammed the brakes, throwing the van into park, and jogged out to open the sliding side door. The cavernous back of the van was filled with spare tires, toolboxes, and an old, cracked leather sofa. Boone didn't ask Sadie for permission. He stooped down, hooked one arm under her knees and the other around her back, and lifted her off the wet asphalt. She weighed almost nothing to him. Sadie stiffened in panic for a split second, her hands flying up to press against his chest, but the sheer exhausted weight of her own body betrayed her. She let her head fall against his leather vest. It smelled aggressively of stale cigarette smoke, wet dog, gasoline, and old rain. It was the most comforting smell she had ever experienced. Boone walked her to the van and set her down gently on the leather sofa. He reached into the front cab, cranked the heater to maximum, and angled the vents toward the back. A blast of dry, burning air hit Sadie's face. Boone leaned into the back of the van. He pointed at her, then raised his hands, palms up, in a universal gesture of questioning. "Where?" Sadie understood. She pointed a trembling finger back down the road, south. Then she held up 3 fingers. Boone frowned. He looked at Reno, who had walked up beside the van. 3 miles, Reno translated softly. She ran from the Turner place, that old cabin tucked back in the pines off the dirt driveway. Boone nodded slowly. He looked back at Sadie. The shivering was starting to subside under the blast of the heater, but her face was still the color of wet ash. "Prospect!" Boone barked, turning to the young kid driving the van. "You don't take your eyes off her. You keep this heat blasting. You follow me." Boone stepped away from the van and walked to the center of the highway. He raised his right arm straight up into the air, his fist clenched. The signal traveled down the line like a falling row of dominoes. 500 engines, idling in a chaotic, thrumming low register, suddenly roared to life with a deafening crackle. Sadie watched through the rain-streaked window of the van. The coordination was fascinating. It wasn't a panicked retreat. It was a tactical withdrawal. Boone and Reno took control of the front. They directed the first row of bikes to pull tight against the rock wall. The second row pulled forward, swung wide into the opposing lane, and executed slow, heavy U-turns, their boots dragging on the wet pavement to stabilize the massive machines. It was an intricate dance of clutch control and balance. The noise was absolute. The canyon trapped the sound of the revving engines, amplifying the exhaust notes into a physical pressure that vibrated the heavy metal panels of the Ford van. Sadie leaned her head back against the leather sofa, closing her eyes, feeling the heat sink into her frozen bones. The pain in her feet was turning into a deep, throbbing ache, trapped beneath the tight compression of Doc's bandages. It took 45 minutes of shouting, maneuvering, and burning clutch plates. But slowly, the massive metal serpent turned its head. When the last of the front guard was facing south, Boone walked back to his Harley. He swung his leg over, kicked it into first gear with a heavy clunk that Sadie felt through the floorboards of the van, and pulled up right in front of the chase vehicle. He looked in the rearview mirror of his bike, catching the eye of the prospect behind the wheel. He gave a single nod. The procession began to move. They didn't ride at 75 miles an hour anymore. They crawled. The entire pack moved at a sluggish 15 miles an hour, matching the pace of the heavy van navigating the deeply rutted, pothole-filled shoulder. Sadie sat up, looking out the windshield. She was leading them back, a deaf girl in a rusted van, acting as the vanguard for 500 outlaws. The 3 miles that had taken her an eternity of agony to cross on foot evaporated in minutes. As they rounded the sweeping curve that opened up into the valley, Sadie saw the familiar, muddy scar of her grandfather's driveway cutting into the dense tree line. She tapped frantically on the glass partition behind the driver's seat. The prospect jumped, looking back at her. She pointed aggressively at the mud path. The prospect laid on the horn, 3 short blasts. Boone raised his left hand, signaling the pack behind him to hold steady. He veered right, his heavy tires slipping momentarily in the thick brown sludge before biting down into the gravel base beneath. The van followed. Behind it, Reno, Doc, and 6 other riders broke off from the main pack to follow Boone up the driveway. The remaining 490 bikes stayed on the highway, pulling to the shoulder, their engines dropping back to that low, menacing idle. They formed a mile-long wall of chrome and leather, waiting. The driveway was a mess. The storm had washed deep trenches into the dirt, turning the incline into a slick, treacherous climb. The van fishtailed, the rear tires spinning and throwing heavy clumps of mud into the air before the prospect managed to wrestle it straight. They crested the small hill, and the cabin came into view. It was a small, weather-beaten structure built from rough-hewn pine, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs. And standing on the front porch, directly under the dripping eaves, was Arturo. Arturo was 72 years old, built like a piece of cured beef jerky, and completely devoid of fear. He wore faded denim overalls over a thermal shirt, his silver hair slicked back against his skull. He was leaning heavily on a wooden cane with his left hand. In his right hand, resting casually against his hip with the barrel pointed safely at the floorboards, was a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun. He didn't raise the weapon when the massive, deafening column of Hell's Angels rolled into his front yard, but he didn't lower it either. His jaw was set like a steel trap. He recognized the winged death's head on their backs instantly. You didn't live in the canyon for 40 years without knowing exactly who owned the highway on the first Saturday of June. Boone killed his engine and kicked the stand down. He stepped off the bike, keeping his hands out away from his body, palms visible. He didn't want to spook the old man. A shotgun at 10 yards didn't care how many friends you had waiting on the highway. "Put it away, old-timer," Boone called out, his voice loud enough to carry over the idling van. "We ain't here for trouble." Arturo didn't move a muscle. His eyes tracked Boone, then shifted to the black van. The side door of the van slid open. Doc stepped out into the mud, reaching back inside. Arturo's grip on the shotgun tightened. Then Doc stepped back, carrying Sadie. Arturo froze. The shotgun slipped out of his hand, clattering against the wooden boards of the porch. He ignored it, dropping his cane and stumbling forward down the 3 wooden steps, his bad knee buckling under his weight. He caught himself on the railing, his eyes wide, locked on his granddaughter's blood-soaked pants and heavily bandaged feet. Boone stepped forward and caught the old man by the elbow before he could fall into the mud. "She's alive," Boone said firmly, looking Arturo directly in the eye. "She's all right." Doc carried Sadie up onto the porch and set her down gently on a faded green lawn chair. Arturo pushed past Boone, practically falling to his knees beside her. He reached out, his calloused, grease-stained hands framing her pale face. Sadie gave him a weak smile. She raised her trembling hands. "I'm okay. Feet hurt. Truck died. Phone died. Bridge is gone." Her signs were sloppy, lethargic from exhaustion, but the meaning hit Arturo like a physical blow. He looked down at her heavily wrapped feet. He looked out at the muddy driveway. Then, slowly, he turned his head to look at the massive, heavily armed biker standing in his yard. Arturo's hands moved. Fast, precise, angry, Sadie translated, speaking aloud for the first time. Her voice was flat, carrying the unique, unmodulated cadence of someone who had never heard herself speak. "He says," Sadie rasped, clearing her dry throat. "He says you are stupid men for riding in this weather." Reno, standing by his bike, let out a sudden, bark-like laugh. Boone just stared at the old man, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a faint, grim smile. "He's right," Boone said. "Tell him he's right." Sadie signed. Arturo huffed, sitting back on his heels. He looked back at Sadie, signing again. "He says thank you for bringing me back." Sadie translated. Boone shook his head. He stepped up onto the bottom step of the porch. The sheer physical presence of the man dwarfed the small cabin. "You don't owe us a damn thing," Boone said, his voice dropping low, stripping away the command and the gravel, leaving only an intense, raw honesty. He pointed a heavy, leather-clad finger at Sadie. "She saved 500 lives today. The bridge is gone. We were doing 70 toward a blind drop." Arturo stopped moving. He stared at Boone, the reality of the situation clicking into place. He looked at his granddaughter, sitting shivering in a lawn chair, her canvas sneakers missing, her soles shredded. She hadn't gone for a walk. She had sprinted 3 miles over broken asphalt to stand in front of a mechanized army. Arturo slowly pushed himself up to his feet. He didn't sign. He just looked at Boone, extending a weathered, shaking hand. Boone took it. The handshake wasn't a pleasantry. It was a lock. A silent, unbreakable contract of mutual respect forged in mud and near death. "Truck's dead?" Boone asked, breaking the silence, looking over at the rusted Ford F-150 parked by the shed. Arturo nodded slowly. "Battery." He mouthed the word, signing it at the same time. Boone turned his head. He didn't yell. He just looked at the prospect standing by the van. "Get the jump box," Boone ordered, "and get the spare battery out of the crate. Swap it. Doc, leave him a bag of supplies. Gauze, saline, Whatever he needs to keep those feet clean until the road's clear. The yard erupted into quiet, efficient motion. The bikers didn't linger to chat. They didn't ask for water. They moved with the synchronized purpose of a pit crew. Within 10 minutes, the hood of the old Ford was slammed shut, the engine firing up with a healthy, rhythmic purr. Doc had left a heavy canvas medkit resting on the porch railing. Boone stood by his bike, pulling his helmet back on. He looked up at the porch. Sadie was watching him. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He raised his right hand, forming a fist, and tapped it twice against his chest, right over his heart. He kicked the Harley into gear. The heavy tires chewed the mud, spitting gravel as he turned back towards the highway. The rest of the vanguard followed, a loud, roaring procession disappearing back down the slick driveway, leaving the cabin exactly as they had found it, save for a running truck and a debt that would outlive them all. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving behind a canyon that looked like it had been chewed up and spit out by a massive, angry god. Route 119 was dead. The State Highway Patrol set up concrete barricades 3 miles south of Sadie's cabin and 5 miles north. For the first time in her life, the deep, thrumming vibrations of 18-wheelers and lost tourists entirely vanished from Sadie's world. The silence was absolute. Recovery was a brutal, ugly process. Doc's field dressings had kept the infection out, but they couldn't knit shredded flesh back together overnight. For 3 weeks, Sadie didn't leave the cabin. She spent her days sitting in her grandfather's worn recliner, her legs elevated on a stack of phone books, feeling the agonizing, tight pull of new scar tissue forming over the arches of her feet. Arturo changed her bandages twice a day. He never complained, but Sadie saw the deep, grey exhaustion settling into the lines of his face. He was 72, a man who had survived a jungle war and 40 years of turning wrenches, but his body was finally betraying him. His hands shook when he poured the iodine. He moved slower. The washout of the Turner Creek Bridge hit the local news. Helicopters hovered over the gorge, capturing footage of the snapped concrete and the violent, muddy rapids below. The news anchors talked about the miracle of the empty highway, marveling that no one had been killed. They didn't know about the 500 motorcycles. The Hells Angels hadn't stuck around to give interviews. They had vanished back down the mountain the way they came, slipping away before the state troopers even knew they were there. Sadie didn't care about the news. She cared about the stack of envelopes piling up on the kitchen counter. They were stamped with red ink. Final notice. Delinquent. Her grandfather tried to hide them, sweeping them into the top drawer of his desk when she walked into the room, but you can't hide the heavy, crushing weight of poverty. Sadie knew the land was mortgaged. She knew the property taxes in the county had spiked. With the highway closed, Arturo couldn't even take in the occasional off-the-books mechanic work that kept their lights on. They were bleeding money they didn't have. By November, the first snow fell. It came down hard and fast, burying the canyon in 2 feet of heavy, wet powder. The cold was an enemy that crept through the cracks in the old pine floorboards. They kept the wood stove burning day and night, but the drafty cabin bled heat faster than they could chop kindling. Sadie's feet had healed into thick, shiny pink scars that ached terribly when the temperature dropped below freezing. She walked with a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of the 3 miles of broken asphalt. Winter in the canyon was usually a time of quiet isolation, but this year it felt like a siege. One evening in late January, the old Ford F-150 wouldn't start. The alternator had finally given out. Arturo spent 3 hours out in the freezing wind, his bare hands slick with black grease, trying to rebuild it with spare parts from a coffee can. When he finally came inside, his lips were blue. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the frost-covered window. Sadie walked over and placed a mug of hot black tea in front of him. He didn't look at her. He just wrapped his trembling hands around the ceramic mug. "We will be fine," Sadie signed, the movement of her hands deliberate and slow. Arturo looked at her hands. He gave a weak, cynical snort. He didn't sign back. He just reached into his heavy flannel shirt, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the table. It was a notice from the county. The property was slated for tax auction in August. If they didn't come up with $14,000 by then, the county was going to seize the cabin, the land, and everything on it. $14,000 might as well have been $14 million. Sadie stared at the black ink. The numbers blurred. She thought about the bridge. She thought about the blood on the asphalt. She had saved 500 men, but she couldn't save her own grandfather from a piece of paper. The universe didn't operate on karma. It operated on math, and their math had run out. They survived the winter on canned beans, venison from a deer Arturo had shot in the fall, and a grim, unspoken stubbornness. Spring came violently, the snowmelt turning the dirt driveway back into a treacherous mud pit. Down the highway, the heavy vibrations returned. The state had finally contracted a massive construction crew to rebuild the bridge. For weeks, Sadie felt the rhythmic, bone-rattling thud of pile drivers smashing steel beams into the bedrock of the gorge. Route 119 was being resurrected. May bled into June. The mud dried. The air turned thick and humid. The new bridge was finished, a wide, ugly span of modern steel and concrete that lacked the character of the old one. But it was safe. The highway was officially reopened on a Tuesday. 4 days later was the first Saturday of June. Sadie didn't expect them. Criminals don't do charity. Outlaws don't keep tabs on the people they encounter. That was the reality of the world. The men she had stopped on the highway lived by a code of violence and brotherhood that didn't extend to civilians. Boone had shaken her grandfather's hand. He had acknowledged the debt. In the cynical calculus of the canyon, that was enough. They had survived. She had survived. The ledger was balanced. But as the morning sun burned the mist off the pine trees, Sadie found herself sitting on the front porch anyway. She wore a pair of heavy leather work boots laced tight over thick wool socks. She had a mug of black coffee resting on her knee. Arturo was in the shed, the rhythmic clang of a wrench hitting metal vibrating through the ground. Noon approached. The air was still. At 11:45 a.m., the coffee in Sadie's mug began to ripple. It started as a microscopic shiver on the dark surface of the liquid. Then it grew. Tiny concentric rings formed, bouncing off the ceramic edges of the cup. The vibration moved up through the wooden planks of the porch, traveling up the legs of the plastic lawn chair, and settled deep in her chest. It wasn't the erratic, heavy thud of a logging truck. It was a synchronized, mechanical wall of sound. Sadie stood up. She walked to the edge of the porch, gripping the wooden railing. Her knuckles turned white. Down at the bottom of the dirt driveway, where it met the newly paved asphalt of Route 119, a single headlight appeared through the trees. Then another. Then 20. They didn't blow past. The lead rider slowed. The brake lights flared, a massive wave of red washing down the highway. The thunderous roar of the engines shifted down into a menacing, idling growl. Boone turned his heavy front tire off the asphalt and bit into the dirt of the driveway. They didn't send a delegation this time. They didn't send a few guys up to check the road. They all came. 500 motorcycles began the slow, grinding ascent up the rutted path. The sheer volume of metal and man was terrifying. They filled the driveway, spilling over onto the tall grass. They parked in the yard. They parked behind the shed. They parked deep into the tree line. The air instantly filled with the sharp, toxic scent of hot exhaust, burning oil, and old leather. It took 30 minutes for the entire pack to shut down. When the last engine was killed, The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and loaded with tension. Arturo stepped out of the shed. He held a heavy iron wrench in his hand, grease smeared across his forehead. He looked at the sea of leather cuts flooding his property. He didn't look scared. He looked deeply, profoundly confused. Boone stood in the center of the yard. He looked exactly the same as he had a year ago. Unmovable, dangerous. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the porch, locking eyes with Sadie. He raised his hand and gestured toward the highway. A heavy, diesel-powered flatbed truck was crawling up the driveway. It wasn't one of their chase vans. It was a commercial rig, the kind used for hauling heavy construction materials. It groaned under the weight of its payload, its air brakes hissing violently as it crested the hill and came to a stop in the center of the yard. The flatbed was loaded with pallets, stacks of high-grade architectural shingles, bundles of pressure-treated 2x4s, rolls of industrial insulation. And strapped to the very back, wrapped in thick plastic, was a brand-new commercial-grade generator. Boone unclipped his helmet and hung it on his handlebars. He walked toward the porch. Reno and Doc followed right behind him. Reno was carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag. It looked like it weighed 50 pounds. "Old-timer," Boone said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. He didn't yell, but his voice carried effortlessly across the yard. "Your roof is bowing, the shingles are shot, and your shed looks like it's going to blow over in the next strong wind." Arturo stared at him. He looked from Boone to the flatbed, and then back to Boone. "I didn't order any of that," Arturo said, his voice raspy. "And I sure as hell can't pay for it." Boone stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at Sadie. He noted the heavy boots. He noted the way she stood, balanced, strong, but favoring her left leg just a fraction of an inch. "Nobody asked you to pay for it," Boone said. He turned around to face the crowd of 500 men standing in the yard. He didn't shout an order. He didn't have to. Men began taking off their cuts. They folded their heavy leather vests, setting them carefully on the seats of their bikes. Underneath, they wore faded black t-shirts, flannel, and heavily tattooed skin. Outlaws, thugs, criminals. They swarmed the flatbed. In utter silence, a chain of 50 men formed from the truck to the cabin. They began passing bundles of shingles hand to hand. Another group walked to the shed, carrying crowbars and hammers they pulled from their saddlebags, and immediately began tearing down the rotted siding. "What the hell is this?" Arturo demanded, stepping forward, his grip tightening on the wrench. Boone turned back to the old man. "This is a debt." For the next 6 hours, Sadie watched the most efficient, violent construction crew on Earth tear her grandfather's property apart and put it back together. They didn't talk much. There was no joking, no music playing. It was purely mechanical. Men who spent their lives breaking things proved equally adept at building them. By 2 o'clock, the entire roof of the cabin had been stripped to the plywood, repapered, and freshly shingled. By 4 o'clock, the shed had been reinforced with fresh pine and insulated. A crew of mechanics had pushed Arturo's F-150 into the center of the yard. They didn't ask for the keys. They popped the hood, pulled the failing engine block with a chain hoist hung from a massive oak tree, and began stripping it down to the pistons. Arturo, unable to stand back and watch someone else touch his truck, waded into the middle of them. Within 10 minutes, he was covered in grease, pointing angrily at a cracked manifold, while 3 heavily tattooed bikers nodded in respectful agreement. Sadie sat on the porch rail. She didn't offer them water. She didn't try to help. She knew her place in this machinery. She was the catalyst. She just watched. At 5 o'clock, the sun began to dip behind the canyon walls, casting long, deep shadows across the valley. The work abruptly stopped. The men packed their tools. They washed their hands in the creek out back. They put their cuts back on, transforming instantly from laborers back into a unified, intimidating army. Boone walked up the porch steps. He didn't stop at the bottom this time. He walked right up to Sadie. He was sweating, his black t-shirt clinging to his chest. He smelled like hot tar and sawdust. He looked down at her. He reached out and tapped the toe of her heavy leather boot with his own. "Boots are better." Boone grunted. Sadie looked up into his face. She saw the heavy miles on him, the scars around his eyes, the permanent tension in his jaw. "Thank you," she signed, her hands moving precisely. Boone watched her hands. He didn't know the language, but he knew the intent. He shook his head slowly. "No," Boone said, speaking clearly so she could read his lips. "We don't do thank you. We balance the books." He reached out his hand, snapping his fingers once. Reno stepped up onto the porch. He held the heavy canvas duffel bag he had carried from his bike. He didn't open it. He just dropped it on the floorboards next to Sadie's boots. It hit the wood with a dense, heavy thud that Sadie felt in her shins. Boone pointed at the bag. "There's $40,000 in that bag," Boone said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's untraceable. It's clean enough for whatever bank is trying to steal this land from under your old man. Pay the county. Fix your truck. Buy better boots." Sadie's breath hitched. She looked at the bag. $40,000. It was a staggering, incomprehensible amount of money. It was her grandfather's peace of mind. It was their home. She looked back up at Boone, her eyes wide, panic bleeding into her expression. "I can't take this," she signed frantically, shaking her head. "It's dirty. It's wrong." Boone didn't need to read her signs. He read her eyes. He stepped closer, leaning down so his face was level with hers. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the man forced her to freeze. "Listen to me," Boone said, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper. 500 men rode up that highway last year. If you didn't stand in the mud, 200 of us would have gone over that cliff. 200 funerals, 200 widows, millions of dollars in bikes gone. He reached out and tapped the heavy, winged death's head patch on his left breast. "Every man wearing this patch threw money in that bag." Boone continued, his eyes locking onto hers, unblinking. "We ain't good men, Sadie. We don't pretend to be. But we pay our debts. You keep the bag. You pay the bank. If you feel guilty, burn the rest. I don't care. But the debt is paid." Sadie stared at him. The cynicism in her mind, the voices that said these men were just thugs and killers, slammed into the reality of the heavy canvas bag sitting on the porch. The world wasn't black and white. It was grey. It was asphalt and blood and $40,000 in a duffel bag from men who understood the raw value of a life. She stopped shaking her head. She looked at Boone, her face hardening, matching his intensity. She nodded once. Boone straightened up. A microscopic fraction of the tension left his shoulders. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, heavy metal plate. It was black cast iron, about the size of a license plate. Deeply engraved into the metal was the club's insignia, followed by a single line of text. "Charter protected." Boone turned and walked to the front door of the cabin. He pulled a heavy lag screw and a driver from his pocket. With 4 quick, violent bursts of the drill, he sank the plate directly into the thick wood of the front door, right at eye level. He turned back to Sadie. "You put that on the gate at the bottom of the driveway," Boone said. "You bolt it tight. Any state trooper, any meth head, any county tax collector comes sniffing around to harass you or your old man, they're going to see it, and they're going to turn around and walk away." He paused, adjusting his heavy leather belt. "Because if they don't?" Boone added, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the promise of absolute violence. "They don't answer to the sheriff. They answer to me." He didn't wait for a response. Boone turned and walked down the steps. Arturo was standing by the truck, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He looked at the roof. He looked at the shed. He looked at Boone. Boone didn't offer his hand this time. He just gave Arturo a single, sharp nod. Arturo nodded back. Two old dogs who understood exactly how the world worked. Boone swung his leg over his Harley. He pulled his helmet on. He kicked the engine over. The vibration hit Sadie like a physical wave. 499 other engines fired up in unison. The sound was deafening, a localized earthquake that shook the pine needles from the trees. They didn't wave. They didn't cheer. They just rolled out. Boone led the column down the mud driveway, their heavy tires carving deep grooves into the dirt. They hit the newly paved asphalt of Route 119, turning north, toward the new bridge, toward the rest of their ride. Sadie walked down the porch steps. She walked over to her grandfather. The air was thick with exhaust, but the sky above was a clear, piercing blue. Arturo looked at her. He pointed a grease-stained finger toward the porch, where the heavy canvas bag sat. He raised an eyebrow. Sadie didn't sign. She just looked at her grandfather, a slow, grounded smile breaking across her face. She reached out and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, smelling the motor oil and the sweat. The vibration of the engines faded into the canyon, moving further north, swallowed by the stone walls and the distance. But the silence that returned to the cabin wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy. It was secure. It was the silence of a ledger permanently closed, written in blood, asphalt, and the unspoken honor of outlaws. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. It helps the channel more than you know. We drop raw, grounded stories like this every week. Tales of survival, unlikely bonds, and the gritty reality of human nature. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe, ring that notification bell, and drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were standing barefoot on that highway? Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that loyalty still exists. See you in the next one.